But the thing that's nice about having this faux bold is that some typefaces don't have bold and italics. So what you can do is you can take the normal typeface and then you can apply like a fake bolding to it or something like that. And you'll notice that the fake bold rounds the edges a little bit. So it really just depends on how pure you want the letter forms to be. So anyway, we might just stick with this, and I'm going to scoot this over again. You can see it takes up more room now that it's bolded like that, and let's just keep it there. And I think that I'm pretty happy with the way that this looks right now. But the other thing I want to do is I want to take this grid off now that I have it kind of set in place. So I'm going to go up to View, and we're going to say Show, and we're going to turn the grid off like that so we can see a little bit more clearly. And notice over here in the layer it turned my type layer into, or excuse me, it turned my regular layer into type layer. So now if I add a drop shadow, see where this FX is? If I click on that, I can say to add a drop shadow, and it goes ahead and it shows me a little bit of a preview, okay? And it's going to go ahead and automatically set the angle and everything for me, and this might not be exactly what I want, so I might want to adjust it. So I think what I want to do is I want to try making the distance a little bit different, like let's say, and we'll take the spread and we'll make it a little bit bigger, and we'll make the size just a little bit bigger because this is going to be pretty large text, and that is nice. It's subtle, it's not too heavy, and I probably would want to change this to like about a 90-degree angle. I typically don't like to skew it too much one way or the other, so, and I'll leave this at multiply, and I'll go ahead and leave the opacity at 75%. Now something else that I could do is I could also add another little effect inside of here. Like you could play with all these different options, and I think that an outer glow might be kind of nice. And one of the reasons I believe that that would be true is because it's going to go on top of blue. Blue and orange are complementary colors, and they'll vibrate a lot. And so if I put a really thin line, in fact, what I can do is I can well, let's just say I'll say OK, and I'll blow this up so you can see it a little bit more closely. And you see that it puts a very fine hairline around that's sort of like this very yellow glow, this light yellow glow. What it'll do is it'll keep it from vibrating too much against the complementary color. And so we can just go ahead and let's see how that looks. The other thing that you can do too, if you wanted, was like we did in our other example, is I could go ahead and add a layer on the bottom here, and I could add blue so that you could kind of get an idea of what it would look like. So let's do that. Let's add a layer, but we need to click and drag it down below the text layer. And then if we go, and let's just find some sort of sky bluish color, somewhere in here maybe, more like that. And let's make it less cyan. Let's just take that color, and we can take the paint bucket and fill the background, and then you can start to see how it helps it stand out a little bit more. So let's go with that. I'm going to need to turn off this layer so that we can export it as a png-24, and I'm going to save for web, and you can see it at 100%, that's fine. And we're going to go ahead and hit save, and I'm going to call it title.png, and I'm going to save it inside of my images folder. Okay, and then the other thing is I'm going to go ahead and save this file too. And I don't want to save the PSD version in images. Remember, we made that working folder. I want to save it inside of my working folder so that all my native Photoshop documents go inside of working. Okay, but I need to save it because I might want to change it up later. Alright, and so now I should have a title.png file here, and let's hit refresh, and you can see that it's gigantic. Wow, that's huge. Alright, well, what it's going to do automatically is it's going, because it's an image, it's going to fill the entire thing. And so what we need to do is we need to scale the image, okay? And there are some tricky ways of doing this. So what I can do is go back to Komodo, and we're looking right here, and what I've got is in my H1. So To scale a picture, what you typically want to do is make its parent container, in this case the H1 would be its parent container, a certain percentage of the screen, and then you tell the image to be a certain percentage of its parent's percentage. Okay, so for instance, let's say that H1, okay, let's make a rule for the H1. Let's say H1 is going to be a width of, let's say 95%. Let's try 90% of the screen right now, okay? And then the other thing I want to go ahead and do is tell it to have a margin. Let's say for the top and bottom we're going to say 0, but left and right we're going to say that it's automatic. Okay, so that should center it. Now you're going to see something interesting happen. Hold on, let's go ahead and we'll save that. Let's hit refresh. And you see that it didn't actually resize the image. Well, that's because we haven't scaled the actual image. Well, all we did was we scaled the H1, and the image is still going to take up as much space as it needs unless we tell it specifically to take up a different amount of space. So let's go back into Komodo, and then what we're going to do here is we're going to say H1 img, and what that'll do is inside of any image that's inside of the H1, which if you look back to our HTML, you'll see that this image, okay, that's inside of the H1 will do something specific. And so what we'll do is we'll say width. And in this case, let's maybe say 95%. Okay. And the other thing that you need to do in order for this to work is you need to tell it to have a display type of block. Okay. And what that's going to do is it's going to turn an image tag, which inherently is an inline element. It's going to make it act like it's a block level element so that the width proportions will actually take effect on it. That's just something that's pretty important. Okay, so let's save that. And I just refreshed my page, and now you see that it scales as I open and close my viewport. Okay, now the reason again for that is because the parent container, which is the heading level 1, is a certain percentage of the screen, and then on top of it, what I did was that the image that's inside of that H1 is only a percentage of its parent, which is of course the H1. Alright, so it's 90% of 90% or something like that, 95% of 90%. And what that's going to do is it's going to always scale the image. Notice that I didn't put a percentage on the height. It will automatically adjust, oops, pardon me, it will automatically adjust the height based on the correct proportions to the width. Okay. Now the next thing that you would want to look at is, well, we've still got this H1 text. I don't want to get rid of that because if a screen reader is looking at that, the H1 text is still very important. So if I want to make this effectively disappear to people who can actually see with their eyes as opposed to having a screen reader read back to them, then what I can do is I can add some tags around it that are generic tags like the span tag. And the reason for the span tag is because span, remember I've told you before, is the generic inline tag, and it doesn't have any inherent semantic meaning or inherent styling to it. So what I can do now is I could say anything that is a span tag inside of the H1, I can visually throw it off the page. But if someone were to strip the CSS off of it, like a screen reader would do, it would still actually read this semantic piece of information that was here, which says the word jet setter. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and go to my base.css file, and I'm going to create a new rule now that says H1 span, so that any span that is inside of the H1 will get a margin. And I'm going to do shorthand here, so I'm going to say margin dash left, or excuse me, not shorthand, I'm going to do longhand, and I'm going to say margin left and be explicit specifically about the left margin and say -999M. Okay, m's are a relative unit of measure, and if I say that it's negative 999, it's going to throw it so far off the page that you wouldn't see it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and it's only going to throw anything that's inside of the span tag, which is also inside of that H1 tag, off the screen. It's not going to actually throw the image tag off the screen, just the span. Okay, so that means that the text that's inside the span, but not this IMG tag. So let's go ahead and refresh the page. Okay, and now that it refreshed, it is showing me just the picture file, which is scalable to pretty much any size, even for a smartphone like an iPhone or an Android, and also it works on a great big huge screen as well. Okay, now you might notice, if you were to look back at the original one, that the margin is a little bit different here at the top and bottom, and that the text looks a little bit bigger than, say, it does here. Not by much, but just a little bit. One of the things that you might want to do is, just by adjusting the size of the image, is to go back and fix that. So if I were to go back into Photoshop to my image, I want to close this character tab, and I'm going to actually close that too, is that I could actually make this thing taller so that as it scales it's going to be doing something a little bit different. So if I go to image, I don't want to go to image size, I want to go to canvas size. So if this is the first time you use Photoshop, then this will be an interesting and useful new tool. And instead of doing inches, this is going to be based on pixels, right? So what I want to do is, I don't want to adjust the width. I'm okay with the width, but I do want to adjust the height. Instead of 550, I want to keep it organized in the center so that it adds a little bit to the top and a little bit to the bottom. So what I can do is I can say, instead of 500, I should say, I want to say 550. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and you see what it did was it increased the canvas size. It didn't actually scale the text or anything, which is good, and that's the way I want it to be, but it gives me a little bit more of a border at the top and the bottom. So I want to save the main Photoshop file, but also I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save for web. And I'm going to overwrite that original png-24 file that I created, and I'm just going to overwrite it and call it title.png, replace it, and then if I go right back to my JetSetter page and I hit refresh, you can see that the dimensions are a little bit different. You've got a little bit of an extra border at the top and a little bit more space between the bottom of the picture and where the content starts. One last thing that you might notice is that the margin on the right side is a little bit greater between the end of this R and the edge of the viewport and the J in the left side of the viewport. And I just realized that one of the things that we didn't do is we didn't adjust something in Komodo in the CSS file. So you'll notice that on the regular H1 we went ahead and we centered it by saying that the top and bottom margins were 0 but left and right were auto. Well, what we didn't do is with the H1 image we didn't center it. So if I copy this code that says margin 0 auto and I also paste it down here in the IMG and I save it, that should fix it. Let's hit refresh, and in fact you see now the margins are absolutely equal. So now whenever I scale this thing, everything is perfectly centered, the title is scaling properly, and everything's good. That's going to be the end of this demo. If you want to go ahead and move on to the last one, or the last set, where I start talking about how to add content with images and paragraphs and how to style stuff to add a lot more features, then go ahead and move on.